Good afternoon. Thank you for watching this virtual lecture event hosted by the Institute of World Politics. For those of you who are new, IWP is a graduate school of national security and international affairs. We have 5 master's degree programs, 18 certificates of study, and a new doctoral program. We also offer the opportunity to take a single course without having to pay an entire semester's worth of tuition costs. One can also audit such a course at a much less cost. If you're interested in learning more about us, please visit iwp.edu. This evening, we will be hearing from Dr. Tara Oh. Dr. Oh is the founder of the East Asia Research Center. She has worked at the Pentagon and the Republic of Korea-U.S. Combined Forces Command as a U.S. Air Force officer, focusing on East Asia issues. Her research areas include national security, alliance, human rights in North Korea, defectors, unification, and political and economic systems. Dr. Oh, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Hannah. Good evening. Is it afternoon or evening? Somewhere in the middle, right? Well, first of all, thank you to World Policy Institute for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to talk about a very topical issue. Let me get the slides up here. Can everyone see the slides? Okay. Hannah, can you see the slides? Okay, great. Okay, so yes, today's topic is China's influence in South Korea. And it will begin with talking about the Belt and Road Initiative, but it'll cover much more than that. And I put my Twitter account and my website there in case you need more information after my briefing. I'd like to give you some sort of road ahead as some sort of outline. So again, I'm going to start with Belt and Road, but I will cover some of these other issues, which I will not talk about individually on this slide, but I will talk about them throughout this next hour. Okay, when I search for Belt and Road Initiative in South Korea, it's very little talked about. So I actually did not know that this existed. And as you can see from this map, this is one of many, many maps that leaves out Korea when it shows the Belt and Road Initiative project. You see Japan on the right side, and to the left of Japan, you see the Korean Peninsula. And of course, the Korean Peninsula north is North Korea and southern part is South Korea. And you can see that Korea is outside of the Belt and Road Initiative, usually on the map. So the question is South Korea part of BRI or not? Well, let me show you the next map. And this is map of South Korea. There's you see numerous Chinatowns there, almost 30. And that's what I was able to discover. There could be more. Now, the oldest one in South Korea, the oldest Chinatown in South Korea is the one in Incheon. And I don't know if you can see the mouse. Can you see the mouse moving around? Okay, well, I'm going to assume that you do. But anyway, it's Incheon, which is on the left-hand side. And that is about 100 years old. So that's the traditional Chinatown that I have known that existed in South Korea. But I was really shocked to see so many others that are there, and many of them are relatively new. Now, just because they're Chinatowns, that doesn't mean that they're part of the Belt and Road Initiative, but definitely some of them are, and I am going to talk about 3 of them today. One is the one in Chuncheon, which is right from Incheon, which is on the left-hand side. If you go to the middle, there's a city called Chuncheon, and that's in Gangwon province. So I'm going to talk about that. I'm also going to talk about the one in Jindo, which is all the way down south and to the west corner. Jindo, Jindo. That's South Korea's 3rd largest island. And I'm also going to, and if you move up north, there's one in Pyeongtaek as well, which is on the west coast. It's a port. And so those are the 3 Chinatowns that I'm going to talk about today. But if you notice on this map, notice how many of them are along the coast. So if you go to the bottom right, Busan, there's one in Busan, which is the largest port in South Korea. And if you look to the left, there are also one in Gwangyang and Yeosu, Chinatowns there. And then also Chinatown, as I mentioned, Jindo is the one that is planned. And if you look below that, there's an island, Jeju. This is also a province. It's the largest island in South Korea. And notice that there are at least 4 Chinatowns there. And again, these are all new. Jeju is also home of South Korea's large naval base that was recently built. So it has some national security implications as well. So let me just go to the next slide and show you how many are in Seoul. And you can easily see that 5, 6, 7, 8, 10. There are 10 Chinatowns within the city of Seoul as well. This is what a Chinatown looks like, what one might expect it to look like, where the tourists like to visit. And again, this is the one in Incheon. It's the oldest one, and it is expanded. And Incheon is, of course, the famous city. It's second largest port city as well, but this is where the Incheon landing occurred during the Korean War and turned the tide. So that's the significance of Incheon. Now, look at this photo. It is, this is Chuncheon city, one that is planned, and it looks very, very fancy, and it's very, very large. It's 297 acres in a very, South Korea's landmass is not very big. It's the size of Indiana, and 297 acres of it will be developed to, it's not just Chinatown, but it's a China complex town. It's a cultural complex. So it's going to have a lot of Chinese cultural aspect to it, and it's a complex, so it's going to have residential area, golf courses, as you can see, but it will have a lot of different buildings and projects within it. And this is 10 times larger than the one in Incheon. And you can see that they plan to invest about $540 million in it. The governor there, Choi he actually went to Beijing in 2018. This was in December. He went there to sign an MOU with the People's Network, which is owned by People's Daily, which is CCP's mouthpiece, and some other entities. And this is going to be a large, again, complex. And People's Daily will be in charge of providing the cultural content. So that's very interesting. But in addition to that, it'll also provide, it'll seek Chinese investors. It'll also be in charge of promotion and advertising. So it has a lot of Chinese participation in this complex. And one thing that I'd like to point out is the last point, which is that there are a lot of South Korean military facilities in that neighborhood. And so it's going to be very close to South Korea's military facilities, which raises national security questions. This is another one that is planned. This is in Jindo, and I mentioned that this is the 3rd largest island on the southern and western tip of South Korea. And it's connected by a bridge, as you can see on the picture, by a bridge to the mainland of South Korea. And what's shocking about this is that it's even bigger than the one you saw earlier. This is 8,969 acres. So it's about 28 times bigger than the one in Chuncheon. And this is also money-wise, it's $15 billion project. So it's huge. So the county of Jindo signed an agreement with China Railway Construction Corporation, which is owned by CCP. And interestingly, this China Railway Corporation was debarred by the World Bank because it falsified information when it tried to participate in a procurement process for a highway project in the country of Georgia. So that's a reputation of that CCP-owned organization, which will be the main partner in creating this large megaplex, large China complex. And this is also a BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. I actually failed to mention that the Chuncheon one is BRI, a Belt and Road Initiative, because the governor also mentioned that it's China's Belt and Road Initiative in China. Now, what the governor said was that it is the only Belt and Road Initiative in China. So he's half right that it is Belt and Road Initiative, but the other half is not quite correct because this one in Jindo is another Belt and Road Initiative. There's even a association called South Korea-China Belt and Road Initiative Association, which received money from this company called BP, $900,000, impressing the BRI members in South Korea. This BP is also interesting because apparently it is owned by Korea. It's Korean owned, but registered in Hong Kong. What's interesting is that there was a journalist who wanted to find out more about this company, BP. And there's a website and it lists the contact information like email and phone number. And he tried to contact them by those methods and no replies. Apparently on the website, it also showed that there is a branch in Seoul. So he actually physically went to the building and the building manager told him that there is no such company in that building. So this is a very mysterious company, apparently with lots and lots of money because it can come up with $15 billion. It can broker agreement between South Korea's local government and a huge company in China, which is owned by CCP. So all this is very, very strange. But what's even more disconcerting is that the project envisions that Chinese will migrate to this China complex town. And they plan to build universities, they plan to build, I mean, it's not just residential areas, it'll have shopping areas, it'll have hotels, it'll have, as I mentioned, at least one university. It'll have electric cars. So it's very futuristic type of town. But again, they want to bring in Chinese to migrate there. And that sort of raises this question about annexation through immigration. And I say that because not only is it about immigration or Chinese migrating there, but in South Korea, Chinese foreigners, but there are a lot of Chinese, and they can, after 3 years of residence in South Korea, they can vote. So South Korean government gives them voting rights to foreign citizens after they live there for 3 years. Now, it seems like there are a lot of loopholes, so they actually can gain the voting right much sooner than 3 years. So that's also a huge issue that a lot of Koreans don't know about. But some Koreans did find out about this, and they put up a petition on the Blue House website. And Blue House is like our White House, so it's where the presidential residence and the offices are. And this petition said, please stop the construction of Jindo Chinatown because they don't want this, again, annexation by immigration going on in that area. This is the last one that I will cover regarding Belt and Road Initiative. This is one in Pyeongtaek. Again, looks very, very fancy. And it's, again, fairly large, not as large as Jindo, but the most significant part about this is that this is very close to the largest U.S. military base in South Korea. And let me show you in the next slide. Here you see there's 3 dots. You see 1 red dot and 2 blue dots. The red dot is where the Pyeongtaek Chinatown is located. I think they're still building this, but that's where the location is. And if you look just to the right of that, you see blue dot, and that is the site of Camp Humphreys, the largest U.S. military base in South Korea. It's only 5 miles away. And if you go slightly north of that, you see another blue dot, and that is Osan Air Base. Now, I've been stationed or worked in both places. The Osan is only about 50 miles away, and that is largest U.S. Air Force Base, which is very, very important if something happens on the peninsula. So again, you got this Pyeongtaek large Chinatown, very, very close to U.S. military facilities, which is also very. So there are force protection issues and national security implications. What's interesting, again, about all this is that this is not really well known not only internationally, but also within South Korea. And in fact, South Korean government also are very quiet about it. The Prime Minister Lee Nak-yeon, he actually, when he went to China back in 2019, so March 2019, he said that South Korea will actively participate in the BRI, but the Blue House denied it. Now, South Korean ambassador to China, Jang Ha-sung, he told Xi Jinping that South Korea wants to actively participate in the BRI. And although the Blue House is denying it, this was shown on CCTV, which is Chinese national TV. So it's hard to deny that there's Belt and Road Initiative, extensive Belt and Road Initiative going on in South Korea. Okay, so when we talk about China's influence, of course, we have to talk about the Confucius Institutes. Of course, within the US, there are quite a few of these, and lately there are more and more that are being shut down in the United States. In South Korea, interestingly, the world's first Confucius Institute was built in South Korea in Gangnam area of Seoul, and Gangnam is the wealthy area within Seoul. And this was back in 2004. So this China's influence activity has been going on since as far back as 2004, probably even earlier. There are a total of 23 Confucius Institutes in South Korea. And that means that South Korea has the largest number of Confucius Institutes among all the countries in Asia. So that's pretty significant. And we all know what that is used for. It's part of the United Front Department effort to use it as a tool for propaganda. And they teach about Chinese dream. In their textbooks, they glorify communism, about Mao, about the Red Guards. So this is really about, again, it's a tool of China's propaganda. But the awareness that this is a threat is very low in South Korea, again, because it's not really covered by the major media. And I also like to point out that there are 70,000 Chinese students in South Korea. And we know that the CCP uses some of these students for propaganda purposes, including attending demonstrations. And there are plenty of demonstrations in South Korea, and some have stated that they heard Chinese spoken at these rallies. So that's, so far we've seen what China has been doing in terms of BRI and Confucius Institutes, but let me talk about how China has been treating South Korea. And this one, I am going to focus on how China treated South Korean President Moon Jae-in when he visited China back in December 2017. Moon became president in May 2017. So he visited China later that year, and he stayed, it was a 4-day trip. And when Moon arrived in Beijing on 13th of December, he was supposed to have lunch with the Prime Minister, Li Keqiang, and dinner with Xi Jinping. Well, they both canceled that when he arrived. I mean, who does that to a head of the state? But Xi Jinping was gone. He was in Nanjing. And so he moved the dinner to the next day. Prime Minister, he wasn't there either. So he moved the lunch, he canceled it and moved the meeting to the afternoon. And there was no joint declaration, no joint press conference. And with, over 4 days, a lot of opportunities for meals with different officials, different figures. And, but Moon, he only had 2 official meals during that time. So it was sort of, and one of them was with a city official, where when he visited Chuncheon. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly. So they sort of dismissed or mistreated South Korea's president. But that was not the only thing. On that trip, there were 2 South Korean journalists that were beaten by the Chinese security guards. And this happened the next day, so day after his arrival. Moon attended the Republic of Korea, PRC, Economic Partnership Convention, which was sponsored by KOTRA. KOTRA is a Korean government entity that promotes trade. And And this occurred in Beijing, and they had press pass and everything. They actually had every right to be there, but they were stopped. And this particular man, the Chinese guards, about 10 of them surrounded him. They kicked him and they just beat him up. And what's interesting is there was a Blue House official that walked by to see what was going on. He peeked over and he just kept on walking. So there was no, they ended up in hospitals, and it seems like the visit continued, and there was no immediate protest about the beating of the South Korean journalists. But what's more interesting is that despite all this mistreatment, this is what South Korea's President Moon did when he visited China. First of all, he took KBS orchestra. KBS stands for Korea Broadcasting Service, and it's one of the, or actually it is the government-owned broadcasting service and one of the oldest in the country. So they have an orchestra that went along, and they played, out of all the music that they could play, they played military anthem of the People's Liberation Army, paying tribute to the Chinese military. Well, which is odd in itself, but this military anthem used to be called the March of the 8th Route Army, which was under Mao Zedong. And in this 8th Route Army, there were some ethnic Koreans that were fighting the Japanese back in 1910s, and around 1910s, 20s, 30s, and another important part about this is that Mao Zedong, during the Korean War, he sent some of these ethnic Koreans that were part of the 8th Route Army to fight against South Korean and the UN forces during the Korean War. So they actually fought against South Korea and U.S. and all the members of the UN sending states, and KBS orchestra was playing tribute to that to them. So that's, again, very, very odd, to say the least. But there are some other things that Moon said, which is shows sort of deference to China. So these are just quotes, and I'm going to read off I know you can see them, but I'll read off some of them. He said that China is not just China, but its existence shines when it socializes with surrounding countries. So China shines. And he also described China as the highest peak and other countries as small peaks, when he said, as the highest mountain peak socializes with the surrounding lower peaks, it is elevated even higher. And he describes China as a great power, and no one's going to argue with that. But he describes South Korea as a small, insignificant country. And this is when he talks about Chinese dream. Remember, Confucius Institute talks about Chinese dream. Well, he says, I hope the Chinese dream is not just for China, but for all of, I can't really see this as well, but all the other countries and for all the humanity. And I think that maybe Hong Kong would disagree with that. Maybe Taiwan would disagree with that. I think a lot of countries would disagree with that. But that's what South Korean President Moon Jae-in said. And he said that South Korea will join the Chinese dream and go together. So this is about other links to China and China's Communist Party. THAAD, Theater High Altitude Air Defense. This is a system that is designed to defend against missile threats. So remember where North Korea used to test all these missiles? Well, even if they don't test missiles, they have a lot of missiles, and they have different ranges. And of course, the short-range missiles, such as Scud, can reach South Korea. So because of that missile threat from North Korea, South Korean government and the U.S. government decided, their allies, right? So they decided to deploy THAAD. And when that was deployed to South Korea, there was huge opposition from China. And because it was deployed, China punished South Korea. And one of the things that it did was it punished South Korean companies. So one was called Lotte, And it had a lot of gigantic grocery stores and department stores and other presence in China. But they basically essentially have to give all that up and leave and lose billions and billions of dollars. So very strong lashback from China regarding that deployment to China. South Korea ended up agreeing to China's demand for 3 no's. And these 3 no's are: 1, no additional deployment of that; 2, no joining of US-led missile defense by South Korea; and number 3, no trilateral South Korea, US, Japan alliance. Now, US is alliance with South Korea, US is alliance with Japan, and while Japan and South Korea are not alliance by treaty, there's close national security relations because Japan is very important to China's security. South Korea's security, especially because Japan hosts UN bases, which are really, really important if something does happen on the Korean Peninsula. But interestingly, South Korea acceded to that. South Korea also, there was an election in April 15th this year, that selected the National Assemblyman. And the South Korean National Election Commission, interestingly, selected LGU plus 5G network for internet, to provide internet at this voting stations. But the problem with this is that LGU plus 5G uses Huawei equipment. And we know what that means. It means a lot of data goes to China, trying to have access to all kinds of data that's on that network. We talk about Cho-guk. Cho-guk is Cho is last name. South Koreans use last name first. So Cho-guk, he was the Justice Minister for about a month, and he had to resign because of all kinds of scandals and corruption. And one is related to this private equity fund called Coding Private Equity Fund. His family invested over $1 million into this private equity fund, which turns out to be funded. $525 million of it was funded by a Chinese CCP-owned public corporation. So again, this is under investigation right now, but some have been wondering whether some of that money was for some sort of political influence. Here's another shocking item. Last year in July, the Democratic Party of Korea, which is a ruling party, it's a party of the President Moon Jae-in. This party signed an agreement with the Communist Party of China. So what is the Democratic Party of Korea doing with signing an agreement with Communist Party of China? It sort of shows some of the leaning of some of the members. So let me talk about Choo Mi-ae. She is the current Justice Minister, but back when she said this, back in 2017, she was a member of the Democratic Party of Korea. And this is what she had to say about land ownership. She said, if Henry George were alive, he could have supported the Chinese method of giving the land use right to Inmin. And Inmin, it means more than people. It means proletariat. It's a terminology used in communist world. So land use right to proletariats and the land ownership to the government. So she's talking about the state ownership of land and property, which is close to the CCP's idea of ownership of property. But she's not the only one. Lee In-young, he is also he was a floor leader until very recently, and he also talked about collectivization of land and how he wants to input that phrase into the Constitution. This party actually in 2018 wanted to change the Constitution to delete freedom from it. And now that they have this huge landslide win, and they don't quite have 2/3 majority, but it's very close. And they will likely initiate changing the Constitution again. And this is something they like to do. They want to talk about collectivization of land and put that in the Constitution. So it's very dangerous. This is Choo Mi-ae, again, with Democratic Party of Korea. She went to Beijing in 2017 when Beijing invited, actually Chinese CCP, they invited various political parties around the world to hold this dialogue in Beijing in 2017. It was over several days in November and December. And Chu Mi-ae, the woman there wearing red, she was the keynote speaker. And here's a close-up. You can see that in the background, it says Central Committee Communist Party. So Communist Party is hosting this, and she's speaking at this event. So it just shows you that there's a lot of engagement or influence at the very highest levels of South Korean government with the CCP. Let me move to another topic that also shows China's influence, and that is coronavirus. And we are still dealing with this here. When this first came out back in, at least in the newspapers around the world, back in January, the headlines read Wuhan Virus or Wuhan Coronavirus or China pneumonia. Those are the terms that were used back then. And what's interesting is the very first action that South Korea's government, the Blue House, took was to tell the reporters to use new type of coronavirus. So they did this to remove the linkage to China, which is very odd. Why would that be the first thing that the Blue House do? But that's what happened back in January 27th. And I highlight this because when back in 2017, before the summit with Kim Jong-un in North Korea, the Blue House also told the reporters to use the honorific term chairman in front of Kim Jong-un. So you can't just say Kim Jong-un, you have to say Chairman Kim Jong-un. So when they did that, all the newspapers, South Korean newspapers, started to use chairman in front of Kim Jong-un's name. And the thing is, they did that, they complied, because if they don't, then the Korea Communications Commission, they can pull their licenses, which means end of that company. So because of that threat, they complied. And there's a case where even the Lee Seok-ju, his wife, should be called Yosa, which is another honorific term. And they wanted that term to apply to not only his wife, but also his sister, Kim Yo-jong, as well as, there was a woman who was the head of this orchestra, this band, another important figure to Kim Jong-un. And there was a defector that was on TV, and he referred to them as that woman. And he was then disinvited from appearing on TV that he was scheduled to appear on. And I think it's because that channel was afraid of what KCC would do, because he didn't use that honorific term. So again, it's very important a step that the Blue House did this, and it just shows how much influence there is about China. So the next day, President Moon visits the National Medical Center. And one of the things he did was he sort of like threatened the medical community, saying that there are administrative, punitive measures that can be taken, basically if this coronavirus spreads, which is very not only odd, but very disheartening to those who are on the front line putting their lives at risk. On January 30th, he also mentioned that fake news about coronavirus is very, sensitive, and it'll be strictly dealt with. Again, I'm not sure why these are his top priorities when it comes to dealing with coronavirus, but that was. So I point this out, that last piece out, the fake news part, because fake news, the term, the definition is determined by whoever wanted to label it. But this is what happened. There's a journalist, Sung, that's his last name, Sung Sang-hoon. He was arrested last week. I think it was last week, May 13th, because on his YouTube channel, he said maybe he died of coronavirus. So because of that comment, he was arrested and by city of Pyeongtaek. And just a little bit of background, there was a Chinese man in South Korea. He was sick, and he was in front of this public clinic, standing in line in order to take the coronavirus test. And while he was in line, he just fell over and died. And we've seen this, video before elsewhere of people with coronavirus dying like that in China. So he just made a comment, maybe he died of coronavirus, and they labeled that as fake news and arrested him. So again, this is very overblown response to what he said. Let me just continue on with what the Moon government's response was to this coronavirus. Lee In-young, I mentioned him earlier. He's the one who talked about putting collectivization of land in the constitution. He also said China is a precious friend that South Korea must live with and help. Now, while they were saying all these things, they never expressed support for Hong Kong, who are out there protesting for their freedom. And Moon Jae-in himself, he also said, China's difficulties are linked to our difficulties. He said South Korea should suffer together with China. Again, very, so this led a lot of the South Koreans to not only be shocked at what he said, but also, wondered whether South Korea is being too submissive to China. And, part of this South Korea suffering together was that he did not block entry of people from China, despite numerous calls by the people. They had signed Blue House petitions. The Korean Medical Association, which is a group of doctors, they also have pleaded with the government to ban entry from China. They did it at least 6 times. All of that were ignored. And this is where, when South Korea had 10,000 tourists from China coming in daily, every single day, 10,000. So that's a large number. And, wouldn't there be somebody infected with coronavirus among that crowd? Just even a tiny portion would be enough. And also, this is when other countries were taking measures. Of course, U.S. shut borders on January 30th. So not borders, but banning entry from China. Philippines did that. Israel did that. Italy did that. So, but not South Korea. I think we're almost toward the getting near the end. But let me just talk about what China's ambassador to South Korea have said, because this is really telling about how they feel about South Korea. So Sing Hai-ming, he is a newly arrived ambassador. He arrived in South Korea on January 30th. He held a press conference on February 4th. This is even before he was credentialed. He basically urged South Korea not to ban entry of those from China. And he said this, and he said follow the WHO guideline. And we also know what WHO guideline was. WHO was a bit slow as well. But he basically put pressure on South Korea not to ban entry. Prior to him, it was CHOO. He was the China's ambassador. And these are, what he said. He said that South Korea and China together is a collective with shared destiny. Again, this is how China views South Korea. He also said that China will play an active or aggressive role on the Korean Peninsula, and it seems like it has so far. But again, it just hasn't been there's not much awareness about this in South Korea because the newspaper doesn't really cover it, the government doesn't really talk about it, but these are clearly going on in South Korea. So, what next? I just want to point out that South Koreans do not want to be submissive or subsumed under China. They don't want to be a vassal state. And most of them support South Korea and the U.S. alliance. So there's very a disconnect between South Koreans at large and what the South Korean government is doing. And the connection between South Korean government and the CCP is very, very disconcerting. So let me stop there and take some questions.
All right, we do have some questions coming in.
Okay.
From an anonymous attendee.
Okay.
Why isn't South Korea working more closely with Taiwan to counter Chinese influence?
So why isn't South Korea doing that?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's for the same reason that South Korean government does not provide or even say any support for those in Hong Kong. If you have seen, the current South Korean government is very pro-China, and that's why.
We have a question here from Robert Alberts. Politically, how did the South Korean people allow the CCP ideology to permeate their society?
Yeah, a very good question. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of people don't know this. So that's one. As far as there being 23 Confucius institutes, if you ask any Koreans walking down the street, they're not going to be able to name that because they don't know. A lot of people, they just don't know. The newspapers don't cover that. So one is because lack of awareness or, very low level of awareness. And the other is they have looked at, well, first of all, China's a neighbor. There's a lot of trade, economic activity, going on between the two countries. And in terms of volume of trade, at one point, U.S. was South Korea's top trade partner, but now it's China in terms of volume. So they think that China is the future when it comes to economic well-being. So I think that's another, and of course that idea has been fed by the media and some of the pro-China elements in South Korea, and I think that's why. Now, when I talked about that what China has done to South Korea regarding that, a lot of people did not like China's response. China threatened to withhold tourists, and actually some of the Koreans said good. So they weren't. They're not pro-China, or they don't want to be subsumed under China by any means. But it's just that the government is behaving very, very differently than the will of the most of the people.
Another question here. Any signs that South Korean officials previously sympathetic to BRI are changing their minds in light of China's actions relative to the COVID situation?
I think the short answer is no, because the people who are involved in Belt and Road Initiative, like I said, so let's say the governor of Gangwon province who signed that MOU in Beijing, he's affiliated, his party is Democratic Party of Korea. And that party in general is very pro-China leaning. And I think that there are a lot of politicians that are influenced by China. I mean, China is doing that with politicians all over the world. You hear about Australia, New Zealand, and U.S. and Europe. China, I mean, South Korea is very, very close. It's right next door. It's to think that they wouldn't, that would be amazing. So.
Why is there an apparent misconnect between the overall feelings of maintaining the U.S.-ROK relations and the results of the most recent general elections? Regional disparities might explain it, but is it anything else?
Yes, right now there's very controversial issue in South Korea about the election fraud. I mean, there could be many, many reasons, but election fraud is definitely one of the issues that's going on. And we're looking at digital fraud because they used the Huawei equipment that provided communications activity. So there has been a long list of discoveries that really makes people question the validity in the whole, voting system and the outcome. For example, the vote counting machine, the National Election Commission assured people that it's a dummy. It doesn't contain any computer. It doesn't have communications capability. But sure enough, it had all this like USB ports in the back. It actually contained some chips inside that actually communicates information or receive information, including maybe potentially hacking. So people are discovering things like this. And of course, there was a study when they looked at the outcome and looked at the statistical data. They found some of the very strange anomalies. And Walter Mabane he's a professor at University of Michigan, and he is an expert in detecting voter fraud, election fraud. And he has this statistical model that he uses. He runs all these numbers through, and he has looked at over 400 elections. So he's a very expert in this field. And his conclusion after he ran all the data through his statistical model is that, yes, there was a fraud. But again, that's one data point. But again, this is an issue. And what's more interesting is that the National Election Commission, which is supposed to be a neutral body, is sort of resisting the public's call to do the recount and also to do the investigation, including handing over some of the electronic equipment. They're not cooperating despite the court order. So again, there's something definitely going on there.
Another question here. Thank you for your presentation. Most of what you talked about has been in the South Korean news, and it is not new that liberal South Korean presidents have always sided with the Chinese. What exactly do you think is a new indicator of China's influence in Korea via their Belt and Road Initiative?
Okay, so let me, so when he says, is he saying that the Chinese influence goes further back than the current Moon administration? Is that the point, or what's the? Because as I mentioned, Confucius Institute that was built in 2004. So yes, it goes back further. It goes back further. Actually, that was actually during Roh Moo-hyun administration. Who, you know, he's very close, current Moon Jae-in. He practiced law together with Roh Moo-hyun. So, and he was, you know, when Roh Moo-hyun went to the Blue House as a president, current President Moon Jae-in, he went to the Blue House, served as chief of staff among other positions. So is he talking about the fact that it goes back further, or is it talking about?
I think the end question there is, what exactly do you think is a new indicator of China's influence in Korea via their Belt and Road Initiative?
So these large projects that I just mentioned, so like I said, not all Chinatowns are considered BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, but the ones that they specifically said is a BRI is the one in Jindo, remember the third largest island, the huge project? That's one. And that was signed, that was just within the last year or two. So this is after President Moon came in. And the other one at Chuncheon, that is also, the MOU was signed in 2018, December 2018. So this happened after he came. So I would say it has accelerated under President Moon.
Another question here. Given the tension between the U.S. and China, what will be South Korea's role forward with regard to North Korea?
Okay, so I think that maybe let me break down. So South Korea is an ally of the United States. And regarding North Korea, I mean, are we talking about denuclearization or? So if we're talking about denuclearization of North Korea, I think at least everyone is, you know, China, South Korea, U.S. are in agreement that that North Korea should be denuclearized. I think the agreement is there. So what is South Korea's role? I think South Korea's role is to work closely with this ally, the United States. And right now, we are focused on the sanctions. So South Korea should also abide by the UN sanctions as well. So I would say that we're closely with the ally, U.S.
You mentioned Chinese who have the right to vote in South Korea. Are Chinese actually exercising their ballots and political power to gain the pro-China policy of current government? Was there any significant example about this in the past?
So very little is written about this. So I think that is an area that requires more research. But in addition to the Chinese being able to vote, the Democratic Party of Korea, there are also some of the members also want to pursue or pass a law that gives automatic South Korean citizenship, which means also voting rights, to those foreign students who graduate with bachelor's degree in South Korea. Now, majority, I think about 70% of those students are Chinese students. And there are 70,000 students in South Korea, so or enrolled in South Korea. So it's to give them automatic citizenship after they get their 4 years of or bachelor's degree. That's just going to tremendously increase the number of people who are from China who can vote. And in other countries, we have a lot of reporting that says that some of these Chinese students are influenced by the CCP officials through their embassies. So.
Another question here. What South Korean demographic, if any, aligns more with the CCP? Is the CCP targeting all of South Korean society with propaganda?
I think CCP in South Korea, they're being very, very quiet. So I think relative to their influence and their activities, hardly anything is discussed. So again, that is very strange, but it's it's sort of like perfect way of doing subversion when people don't even know that it is occurring. So I think a lot of people are just not aware. I think that is the main problem. People not aware because it's not covered by the media in general.
You mentioned that there are loopholes in granting South Korean citizenship to foreigners in 3 years after they immigrate to South Korea. What are they?
So I can think of, let me just talk about one. So let's say they make a huge investment, then they can expedite that process. So if you invest, bring a lot of money into Korea and invest, then that can expedite the process. So, I mean, I don't have a list of everything, but that's one of them.
Do you believe that a multilateral security structure would resolve the North Korea issue regarding denuclearization?
Do I believe in multilateral structure for, you mean like the six-party talks?
Mm-hmm.
I think we have moved on from that. I mean, we tried it. I don't know for how many years we've tried it. So it has not worked. So, here we are, and North Korea has advanced their nuclear weapons program even more since then. So, I mean, we'll have to see where this goes. But from what I'm reading, that they are definitely hurting by the sanctions. So we have to see, how. I mean, there's definitely room to apply more sanctions for sure.
Do you think the U.S.'s decision to defund the World Health Organization helps or hurts Taiwan's efforts to be recognized as an independent nation?
That is like so totally outside of the topic that I'm discussing. So maybe I'll leave that to others who are experts in that field.
In their eyes, what do South Korean politicians get for being pro-China? What is the quid pro quo in their eyes, especially if there's no popular support for China?
Quid pro quo to whom? To the Korean people or the Korean politicians?
I'm assuming the Korean politicians.
Okay. Well, I mean, so the United Front Department and their method of buying off politicians is, traditional methods like money or, there are other incentives, I'm sure. But I think not particularly in the Korean case, but their modus operandi is there are enough written about how they buy off politicians. I think it's probably one of the oldest projects that countries have worked on. So I think there's plenty of information regarding that, and I think it does involve money among other things.
Another question here. Given the proximity of Pyeongtaek, Chinatown, to Osan Air Base, to what degree are China's and North Korea's intelligence services collaborating in their efforts to spy on U.S. military bases and personnel in South Korea?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have the answer to that, but I think if you go back to their interests, they have common interests. Their common interest is that they don't want U.S. forces there to protect South Korea. So, if you start from their common interests, you can sort of see where that would lead them to do.
Are there any student reactions from the local Korean universities regarding the pro-China statements of the Korean politicians?
I really haven't seen much. Again, it's not. Again, awareness is just so low. But when it does become an issue, such as what China did to South Korea when that was deployed, there were a lot of among younger generation of South Koreans. They definitely did not like being treated that way. So there are reactions if they know about it.
Okay, another question here. Can you describe the Chinese cultural complexes a little bit more? I think one of the slides mentioned that there would be free trade zones involved. What sort of businesses/industries would be there?
Yeah, so I don't have all the information, but a lot of countries have a free economic zone, or those zones that are where it's like duty free. So they sort of fall in order to promote the investment there. They sort of allow certain things to happen that so maybe again duty free, some sort of tax benefits to the investors. Now, I don't know for sure, but within the Chinese complex cities, again, there were some suspicions of maybe even bringing Chinese police to enforce the order, which would definitely be, basically giving up the territory to China. Now, I haven't seen any definitive documents on those, so I just want to, make sure that, these are hypothetical. But again, it just means that it falls outside of the regular laws and rules that the rest of the territory falls under.
Another question, what impact will China's escalating trade conflict with the U.S. have on South Korea?
I think, when South Korea, United States and China are two, large countries. And when their trades are, affected, it'll probably have some impact on South Korea as well. But I think right now the trend is a lot of the companies are moving out of China. U.S. companies, maybe some of the other companies. Some of the South Korean companies, because of the THAAD, what happened under THAAD, and how they really went after some of these companies. Some of them have also relocated to other countries even before this coronavirus. So, but in terms of South Korea's economy, it actually started to go down. Like, for example, its economic growth forecasted started to go down. Its national debt has just jumped. National budget has ballooned again under the Moon administration. So its economy is not, even without the coronavirus, even without the tension between U.S. and China, it was already going downhill. So this will probably not going to help.
Does South Korea have in place a mechanism for national security screening of foreign investments?
I don't know that, but from what I've seen, again, with this BRI projects in Chuncheon and Jindo, I don't think that's the case, but I don't have a good answer for that.
Another question, can you expand on your comment about annexation through immigration? Do you mean that Chinese immigrants into South Korea would somehow facilitate annexation of South Korea by China?
I think the concern that some of the Koreans in the region had, I think we sort of need to look at history. We know, like, Stalin has relocated people to different places in order to expand the territory. China are relocating some of the Han Chinese, I would say, to Uyghur area, where they are going in physically living in these houses. They took away the men to prison camps, and then they go and live with the women. So again, these are, with this Chinatown, complex towns, it's not quite like that. But given that they want to create this, some sort of fusion of a culture, they want to, again, with the voting rights, I think some of the concerns that South Koreans have, I think it's genuine given the history.
Well, I believe that is all the time that we have today. I apologize if we weren't able to get to your questions, but I would like to thank Dr. O for joining us today and all of you who tuned in here on Microsoft Teams. If you're interested in attending other upcoming webinar events, supporting IWP, or applying to one of our graduate programs, please go to iwp.edu. Again, that is iwp.edu. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, everyone.